Carol back yet? Lindy Callahan demanded of her brother as she walked into the small kitchen of the two-bedroom apartment she shared with her husband and Steve. Steve Kyle ignored her until she pulled out the chair and plopped down across the table from him. No, he admitted flatly. He could see no reason to hurry. He already knew what Carol was going to tell him. He'd known it from the minute they'd walked out of the King County courthouse, the divorce papers clenched in her hot little hands. She was remarrying. Well, more power to her. But he wasn't going to sit back and blithely let her rub his nose in the fact. Steve, Lindy insisted, her face tight with impatience, it could be something important. You told me it wasn't. Sure, that's what Carol said, but, oh, I don't know. I have the feeling that it really must be. It isn't going to do any harm to call her back. Methodically, Steve turned the page of the evening newspaper and carefully creased the edge before folding it in half and setting it aside. Lindy and Rush, her husband, couldn't be expected to understand his reluctance to phone his ex-wife. He hadn't told either of them the details that had led to his and Carol's divorce. He preferred to keep all thoughts of the disastrous relationship out of his mind. There were plenty of things he could have forgiven, but not what Carol had done. Not infidelity. As a lieutenant commander aboard the submarine USS Atlantis, Steve was at sea for as long as 6 months out of a year. From the first, Carol hadn't seemed to mind sending him off on a 3 to 4 month cruise. She even used to joke about it, telling him all the projects she planned to complete when he was at sea, and how pleased she was that he would be out of her hair for a while. When he'd returned, she'd always seemed happy that he was home, but not exuberant. If anything had gone wrong in his absence, a broken water pipe, car repairs, anything, she'd seen to it herself with barely more than a casual mention. Steve had been so much in love with her that the little things hadn't added up until later. Much later. He'd deceived himself by overlooking the obvious. The physical craving they had for each other had diluted his doubts. Making love with Carol had been so hot it was like a nuclear meltdown. Toward the end, she'd been eager for him, but not quite as enthusiastic as in the past. He'd been trusting, blind and incredibly stupid when it came to his ex-wife. Then, by accident, he'd learned why she'd become so blasé about his comings and goings. When he left their bed, his loveless, faithless wife had a built-in replacement, her employer, Todd Larson. It was just short of amazing that Steve hadn't figured it out earlier, and yet, when he thought about it, he could almost calculate to the day when she'd started her little affair. Steve! Lindy's voice cut into his musings, and he lifted his gaze to meet hers. Her eyes were round and dark with concern. Steve experienced a small twinge of guilt for the way he'd reacted to his sister and Rush's marriage. When he'd learned his best friend had married his only sister after a dating period of a mere 2 weeks, Steve had been furious. He'd made no bones about telling them both the way he felt about their hurry-up wedding. Now he realized his own bitter experience had tainted his reasoning, and he'd long since apologized. It was obvious they were crazy about each other, and Steve had allowed his own misery to bleed into his reaction to their news. Okay, I'll return Carol's call, he answered in an effort to appease his younger sibling. He understood all too well how much Lindy wanted him to settle matters with Carol. Lindy was happy, truly happy, and it dismayed her that his life should be at such loose ends. When? Soon, Steve promised. The front door opened, and Rush let himself into the apartment. His arms were loaded with Christmas packages. He paused just inside the kitchen and exchanged a sensual look with his wife. Steve watched the heated gaze, and it was like throwing burning acid on his half-healed wounds. He waited a moment for the pain to lessen. How'd the shopping go? Lindy asked, her silky smooth voice eager and filled with pleasure at the sight of her husband. Good, Rush answered and faked a yawn, but I'm afraid it wore me out. Steve playfully rolled his eyes toward the ceiling and stood, preparing to leave the apartment. Don't tell me you two are going to take another nap. Lindy's cheeks filled with crimson color, and she looked away. In the past few days, the two of them had taken more naps than a newborn babe.